and welcome to Varn Blog Solo. I've been reading Raymond Geuss, Not Thinking Like a Liberal, and thinking about my values. Now, in some ways, values adjudications is a narcissistic pastime. So many people use values as a means of personal branding. Talk about that all the time when I talk about cultural narcissism or the hollowing out of selfhood and the kinds of organizations that we have. But people have asked how I went from paleo-conservative to liberal. And I always tell them I was never a liberal. That I went from a kind of nascent Chomskyist anarchism as a teenager that was exposed to stuff on college radio that I picked up from literally running a coat hanger to a boombox from like 1987 from Atlanta, which was pretty far away, and I got it the best on stormy nights. But anyway, and from zine culture, which I was involved in as part of the music scene. And then from there, I talked about how the Antiwar protest struck me and how I just had a negative response to a lot of college students involved in both the alter globalization movement and the anti-war protests, and moved into right-wing anti-war for a very brief period of time, but found the economic and social conceptions to be unpersuasive. And I still do. But I've always doubted liberalism. And I've always seen it as more pervasive on both conservative and the left, even in periods where they're both damning liberalism. It's a doth protest too much kind of damnation. I've seen many Gen Xers move from far left to far right in a way that mirrors the non-existent horseshoe theory that you once see liberals talk about, just because they are responding to liberalism, but also because they don't question many of the assumptions in their own worldview. Most of the reactions to liberalism today, be they on the far left or the far right or even the libertarian, have illiberal elements. And in fact, one of the interesting things about liberalism has been the dominant ideology for so long, it no longer has a need for any kind of coherence. We can trace its genealogy. I always talk about going back and look at classical liberalism, but classical liberalism is not libertarianism, as is often claimed in the middle to late 20th century, nor is it exactly U.S. progressivism, nor do social democratic responses to it, or even some far leftist responses to it, beyond its categories. However, one fears about Adorno when he says a wrong life cannot be lived rightly. It kind of applies here. This brings me to Raymond Geuss, and I wanted to read this to you from the preface of Not Thinking Like a Liberal, because it both is very different from my situation. Geuss is, while he's of the post-Habermas generation of the Frankfurt School, he's the most loyal to, I would say, even the pre-Horkheimer and Adorno Frankfurt School. And people forget that even though we refer to the first generation of the Frankfurt School as Horkheimer and Adorno, that there was a prior generation that had strong ties to Austro-Marxism, of which Heinrich Grossmann is one, but also the founders of the school in Germany were amongst them. And it was kind of a Marxist development of social research that was an answer to what was going on in the historical school, and a kind of parallel program that was going on in Red Vienna. Now, it's more complicated than that, and I really should go over the history again. I did a partial essay on its history for Zero Books back in the day, which I think is no longer publicly available, so I might need to remake it. And I have more knowledge now, and I have a more complicated view. But I also find that going into the early history of the Frankfurt School just gets messy. And there also is the strange relationship of the Frankfurt School to the U.S. intelligence services, particularly in Marcuse and two other members who joined the OSS to fight the Nazis. But even Marcuse himself seemed to have suspicions about the tensions around Adorno later. However, snitch jacketing is not my thing, and I have not found the evidence completely compelling on that. But I do admit that Habermas's discursive view is not totally discontinuous with elements in the Frankfurt School of its, high Adorno-Horkheimer period. Particularly, there's a need to deal with, however, the other members of the Frankfurt School, Friedrich Pollock, Heinrich Grossmann. There's the people of the first generation to really get a fair understanding of what was going on there. But this brings me to Raymond Geuss. Geiss's relationship to the Frankfurt School is also not entirely clear to me. He is an interesting figure of the post-70s Frankfurt School. He's the one I like. Clear philosopher. Was a scholar of political philosophy in 19th century European philosophy and was an emeritus professor of philosophy at Cambridge. And his early book, The Idea of Critical Theory, I have back there on my shelves. But he's, from Columbia. And he's interesting because he is a thinker who was respected by people as different as the Frankfurt School, but also as Alistair McIntyre, the Marxist come Aquinian communitarian, etc. A lot of my intellectual heroes and frenemies are in the list of Geiss's fans, which is not true for some of the other members of the post associated with the post Frankfurt School tradition, such as Axel Honneth or Habermas himself. Let's go into this book, though. And yes, the other thing about him, even though he's associated with European philosophy, I do believe Geuss is an American. This is from the preface to Not Thinking Like a Liberal. It's a good book. It is kind of one of these rare things of both a philosophical memoir and also a kind of interesting theoretical intervention. The Anglo-Saxon political, social, and economic model, the combination of the capitalist economic system with a liberal form of parliamentary democracy, seemed to work well for Great Britain and its English-speaking former colonies from the end of the 18th century to the end of the 20th century, especially well for elites in those countries. And this shows up in our talking about Michael Sandel and the way that tradition morphed from kind of civic republicanism and the Anglo-Saxon tradition of common law all the way up to the neutral administrative space and into the crisis mode that it currently seems to be in. In the second half of the 20th century, it even seemed to be establishing itself as the major benchmark for all modern societies. Thank you, Fukuyama. However, it has now been visibly unraveling for the past decade or so. The increased speed of this decline in the last 5 years during the ascendancy of Donald Trump in the United States and the campaign in the United Kingdom to leave the European Union has been staggering. I would like to point out, however, that the center-left has been having trouble everywhere. And actually, those manifestations happened before Trump and Brexit. But nonetheless, I think there's still an important thing to deal with here. There's always been a certain tension in the way the Anglo-Saxon model perceived in Britain and the United States. On one hand, it was presented as a universal paradigm to which all peoples and all societies aspired, and the adoption of which would be their own manifest self-interest. A rule-governed international system of parliamentary capitalist societies was the solution to the riddle of history, which known itself to be that solution, to use a phrase that Marx uses for a very different political project, communism. On the other hand, it is very clearly understood, although perhaps never clearly stated, that if the whole world adopted capitalist liberal democracy, the result would inevitably be that we, the Britain and the United States as political entities and the members of the dominant social economic groups within each of these two societies, would remain reliably on top. One can see the tremendous ideological power of a construct that combined universalist pretensions with hard-headed self-interest, especially when it seemed to be confirmed by tangible economic and military success. It is difficult, I think, for anyone who grew up in one of those two societies to appreciate how odd it was to assume that these two aspects, the universalist and the exceptionalist, would reliably continue to be correlated forever. Even those clearly socially, economically, and politically downtrodden, and who might have been expected to have no special motive to adopt that ideology, did not necessarily find it easy to articulate their dissatisfaction because they lacked the appropriate concepts and the appropriate framework. This comes up in our discussions of Michael Sandel as well, from a very different context. Members of marginal groups within their own theoretical traditions, even if they were deeply pre-modern, might have a better chance of seeing the conflict between these two aspects clearly. I think that is often the case. As the economic and political situation became more troubled for the United States and for Britain, the tension between these two conceptions became harder to ignore and manage. In his own crude way, Donald Trump saw this and drew a coherent, if repellent, conclusion. The economic crisis of 2008 was directly caused by the deregulation of the banking system. That is, by the application of what certainly looked like standard liberal principles to the realm of finance. For a while, however, people seemed unwilling to recognize the significance of this fact, and when they did, their reaction was surprisingly muted. The stress created by the economic collapse, however, had a gradual ripple effect that took a while to propagate. Only eventually, almost a decade later, did it cause the political systems in the United States and Britain to seize up. Whatever the exact ideology, Trump and Brexit have significantly dented the international appeal of a form of society that justifies itself by the citation of John Locke, Adam Smith, the Federalist Papers, and John Stuart Mill. Liberalism is such an important part of the ideological framework of the Anglo-Saxon countries that the real economic and political decline of the United States and the United Kingdom cannot be expected to be without effect on the fate of liberalism. I wrote this text in January 2001 under lockdown during the coronavirus pandemic, just after the United Kingdom left the European Union. I do not mourn the passing of liberalism. Neither do I. These reflections also stand in this other, slightly different political context. In a way, the whole text is an indirect lamentation of the loss of which the departure of the UK from the EU entails. My unbelievably privileged position as a retired professor with various entitlements, for instance, pensions, makes me relatively immune to the catastrophic economic effects of Brexit. And those effects are catastrophic. England is not looking to be doing well next year. And its reversal does not seem really easy. And in fact, that is why there's so much workerist activity in the UK, I think. The reatomization of unions, but people who want Corbynism to be back off the industrial union policy of the 50s and 60s have to kind of ignore that union policy was the result of a whole lot of process of imperial accumulation that it had just barely lost. And that isn't coming back. Furthermore, the damage was really done with the changes of the economy, the world economy, not just even in the United States and the Anglophone countries, but even in places as far-flung as China, which made the British competitive advantage in any kind of productive market really hard to reimagine. You can't run a coal shop and shopkeepers republic on a country that's really geared everything towards international finance for a long time. And yes, things have been worse in Britain than people have let on, actually, for a while. I mean, there are parts of Britain, most of Britain, whose economic prosperity was around that of Mississippi in the United States on a good day. But Britain's current economic crisis and the fact that it no longer really seems to have the currency sovereignty that it once did indicates that the empire is truly over. And I think Brexit accelerated that. But Corbyn's own inability to deal with Brexit was part of his political problem. Sure, there were others. Yes, the military's after him. Yes, Zionists went after him too. Yes, most of the establishment of Labour was still after him because they still had roots in the Blair period. But there's also other fundamental contradictions that bled out to the general public. Having to keep the remainders and his own Euroscepticism together never made a whole lot of sense for Corbyn, and left Brexit never made a whole lot of sense either. Which leaves you in an impossible situation. Is it the neoliberalism of going it alone and trying to replicate the autonomy that you had as the core of a major empire priorly, or the neoliberalism of the European Union, of which you had actually a pretty sweetheart deal? Hard to say. Which would have been ultimately better for the British public? Well, one would have made this current situation happen a lot slower, I think. Nonetheless, let's continue. Much of what is lost of what remained of the British political power and influence in the world is something which I think might not actually be so bad at all. But the massive cultural loss is that one of a concomitant words that I have read a bunch and never said aloud, of severing the ties of the European Union is one I think I will probably never get over. Thinking about Brexit and what the future holds for us automatically summons up for me the memories of Philadelphia I knew when growing up there in the late 1950s, just before I left to go to boarding school. A place trying desperately to live up to the image of itself derived from a distant past and fully aware that it was failing in that. Philadelphia had been a significant city in the 1790s, and by 1955, everything important was taking place elsewhere. And by the way, this is not just true for Philadelphia, Cleveland, Ohio, a lot of the Midwest. It's really true for places like St. Louis and Minneapolis and the industrial Midwest, which is where a lot of stuff pops off now. Why does it pop off there? It's not hard to see. You can talk about Detroit one day. My boarding school, too, lived up to a highly stylized past, which I shall describe in this book. Brexit, too, is partly the dream of returning to a fantasy past in which the population of the UK was racially and culturally exceptionally homogenous, and society was powerful enough and yet isolated enough on its islands to be able to make decisions without much references to all the opinions, interests, and needs of its immediate neighbors, or indeed the rest of the world. The primary topic of this book is liberalism. The secondary one is the logic of living in a bubble of nostalgia. Readers may find more details about Catholic theology, belief and practices, about obscure religious polemics, and about early Christianity than they expected, and more than they can easily tolerate. The inclusion of this discussion might be particular for a number of reasons. After all, I'm not an expert on any of this material, and my opinions are nothing more than reports of what I heard in the 1960s from secondary school teachers who himself was no master of any relevant fields even as they existed in 1960. The reason for hashing this now is a general point that I'm trying to make with this story. I wish to claim that growing up as a member of a subgroup with its very own dense and theoretically reflected history, me too, from both Catholic and Jewish stock, me too, and would an account of how history fitted into the rest of the world as a whole gives one the cognitive advantage, at least when it comes to resisting the allure of certain rights resolutions that are deeply rooted and perniciously reinforced by the normal operations of social protest. Also, being a Southerner helps, although it leads to its own toxic nostalgia, as we all know, who've ever dealt with anything neo-Confederate, but one of having lost and also feeling like you maybe really were the product of the bad guys in a civil conflict is one that does weigh on a whole region's consciousness. Nonetheless, I will continue. Plenty of Southerners have embraced Americana and their own rebellious past as a way to nullify any responsibility for that past and the contradiction between the two, I think. Nor will they be the first to do so. I mean, the Scottish past and other cultures of defeat have dealt with this thusly. This can be true even if the ideology of the subject in question is in itself not anything that reflected upon one might care to embrace. Same. Lenin and Lukács both spoke of the need for an ideology for the proletariat. It was not enough to be oppressed or even know that one was oppressed. One also had to have ways of not just expressing the distress one felt, for instance, in songs, but articulating and refining it theoretically and connecting it with the general view of society, human action, and history. One needed something like what Catholicism had provided. So I expectorated perhaps a greater length than one might feel absolutely necessary about Catholic details. It seemed appropriate to me for these purposes to give the reader some sense of how substantial, how detailed, how interconnected and historically excellent, and how historically aware this ideological form was and in some places still is. A further reason I find is somewhat surprising and to me dismaying, the resurrection of traditional religion in Western societies in the past 20 or 30 years. Given my general Feuerbachian approach to religion, which seems to me arising from the unsatisfied human needs, I really ought to have expected this resurgence from the colossal failure of political action, which became evident at the end of the 1970s with the sustained growth of human inequity since the 1990s. But the fact I was surprised. I expected people to look for satisfaction in more privatized and esoteric forms, which they also did. I mean, one of the things that I will push back a little bit on Geuss for is the nominal religiosity of the past has come back in traditional religion, but traditional religion and religious attendance is in every vector declining in both Europe and even in the United States, which until until the 1990s and the 2000s looked to be the outlier. And particularly in the 1980s and mid 1990s, it looked at not just that religion was coming back, but it was coming back in a particularly strange form, one that was post the modernist constructions in Britain in the 19th century, but had gone back to a seemingly modern but quasi-scientificized fundamentalism. Now, I could go more into what this means because in some ways there is a fundamental break between American Protestant fundamentalism and even traditional or traditionalist Protestantism, and most definitely from traditional Christianities. But there's a real sense in which that seemed like such an outlier, and it was growing expansively at the expense of mainline Protestant denominations up until the late 90s. And in the late 90s, something happened, and we saw a large shift, partly from immigration, but partly from also fundamentalists leaving the Protestant movement for things like Orthodox Christianity, traditional Catholicism, etc. But in that same time period, we've seen a vast secularization of society. Now, people will point out that megachurches exist, but I will point out that megachurches actually prove that religious institutions need these massive centralized apparatuses to maintain themselves because they don't actually permeate enough of society at the same level to maintain a large, fragmented, individual set of institutions. There's just not the people to maintain 1,000 little community podunk churches anymore. And even the ones that do so at high economic cost. And I'm here thinking of the LDS, who do maintain community wards by design, but do so at a very high cost. And they have to mandate tithing, which is why they're the second richest religious organization on the planet. And the first richest is rich off of historical holdings, which it's had for 2,000 years. So make of that what you will. Difficulty, of course, is in the way that defining the philosophical difficulty of our time is that we have become rightfully suspicious of all totalizing ideological construction, such as communism or Catholicism. And this is reflected, I think this is not just reflected in our distrust of social institutions, it's that the social institutions are materially too hard to maintain. You know, I've talked about Anton Jaeger and Bowling Alone and how this oligarchical need is fundamentally shifted. But nonetheless, it is still an oligarchical need. This means that the real total ideology of our era, the conjunction of democracy, liberalism, capitalism, actually presents itself as something other than a total ideology. In fact, it is in some of its more sophisticated forms that it presents itself as an anti-ideology par excellence. Yes, almost anyone who talks about how ideology is a problem is usually a liberal who is not aware of their own ideology. Now, part of that we could go, and I've talked about the history of the term ideology going all the way back to its French liberal capitalist origins. It's a kind of proto-sociology, and then how it was used by the young Hegelians and by Marx, and how Marx kind of doesn't keep it as a terminology, and it gets resurrected a little bit after Lukács and a lot after Althusser. Ironically, Althusser picks up on it, even though, yes, it is used a little bit in late Marx. It's not used in the same way or near extensively as the early Marx, which Althusser rejects as unscientific. Make of that what you will. Particularly since the Althusserians don't like alienation because they consider it unscientific, but alienation is a justification for commodity fetishism, which is the big innovation, one of the big innovations in late Marx. I don't know. Do with that whatever you will. It is not hard to see through specific deception. It is not hard to see through this specific deception, but even when we have done that, we will still be confronted with the inherently unstable and uncomfortable situation. We seem, for a variety of reasons, to need something like a total worldview, and yet we have reason to believe that none, at least none of those available to us, will be satisfactory. The intellectual life of the moderately observant and the intelligent person in our times has consisted of a series of business trips, expeditions, rambles, and almost aimless wanderings through a landscape that is essentially structured by what seems to be a great paradox, that total worldviews seem both indispensable and untenable. There's no social community in which to maintain them. That's me talking. They are directed towards a goal, even if that goal, as in the case of our expedition, is discovering something new. A ramble isn't like that at all. It is characterized by more internal spontaneity and is responsive at best to whimsy and the pleasure of the moment. A truly aimless wandering is even less structured. Now, stop there because he's talking about the nature of the text. A friend of mine, a close friend of mine, one of my best friends, told me that she noticed the strange relationship not just between, formerly observant Jews and Marxism, which has been oft noted and made a lot of by the right, but also the preponderance of Catholics and Marxism. It's something to think about, because these are attempts to get beyond modernity in some ways. The Lester McIntyres of the world are probably not as odd as we would like to believe. And I am proof of that, but in reverse. Well, I've never been a Catholic, and I've been in both Jewish and Buddhist traditions, because of the particular nature of the time in the life my father raised me. There has been a sense in which I have greatly learned and respected the Catholic tradition as a counter to Anglo-Saxon modernity, and yet also have not seen it as viable or even attractive. And a lot of people who fetishized it and became what I like to call the Brooklyn Bar Catholics, or the Dime Square culture warist, or whatever you want to call them, are in a similar predicament, where this becomes another affectation, just like the radical chic of one's 20s often is. Between Tumberlites and traditionalists, the truth is rarely found. But we do have to take this seriously, because one must understand that the values actually matter. I talk about cybernetics and the brain and ideology, and the reason why you need an ideology of the proletariat, or the reason why you need a system 5 and viable systems theory, the reason why this incoherence really does matter, right? It's not just that the left isn't got a class subject, that the left doesn't know how to produce a class subject, and neither does the right. While the right is probably hurt by this less than the left, and I have been reading on debates around Anton Jaeger's recent articles on Robert Putnam and his assertions that maybe the right actually is hurt by it. I see evidence that it is, particularly in the religious communities, in ways that makes them more volatile and more likely to lash out. But can they win? I don't know. I doubt it. But can the left win? I don't know, but I see no evidence of it. And as things continue to be hard, you see more and more weird, combinatory, and degenerate ideologies. Degenerate not in the sense that people who believe them are degenerate in some moral sense. That's not my point. I'm kind of irrelevant. Degenerate in the sense that they believe contradictory things with no attempt to reconcile them, just to paper over them by pure assertion. But without the power of actually running a state to try to power through that, it doesn't work. It becomes more and more incoherent, more and more transitory, and is really the result of needing niche markets and to try to differentiate yourself in an ideological space where niches are stable forms of income. Do I think that people doing that know they're doing that? No, but it's irrelevant. People don't need to know what they're doing for it to be true. But this brings us to liberalism. I have been reading liberalism a long time. I can think of, from Dominic Loserto to those big, massive books on the Enlightenment by Jonathan Israel, etc. I find the contradictions and the way that most of the ideologies spawned in response, even the ones in response to liberalism that are anti-liberal, are still rooted in it, to tell you something about the sticking power and yet the other incoherence of the two major claims. I mean, after all, the liberal society both is, in that contradiction that Geuss points out. We also see another contradiction, and kind of a more interesting one, that societies that were nominally egalitarian, at least within limited spheres, which those spheres were expanded, producing the most unequal society the world has ever known. Both in material context and in many ways in other contexts, legal, etc. So much so that The idea of holding liberals accountable to their own ideology, it doesn't even seem possible anymore. And everything seems recuperable. All radical chic can be resold to you. Not just in capitalist society, but in what remains of bourgeois society as a whole, whether one thinks bourgeois society and capitalist society were necessarily the same thing or not. Anyway, lots to think about here in Geist. And we'll be returning to this book like we're returning to many books. Sandel's back on the docket, Baudrillard's tradition back up. And I am finally going to start going back into Marx and Lenin and Marxology, because no, I haven't abandoned Marxism. I just wanted people to realize that my view of this comes from a much larger view of readings and dealings with things than just the Marxist tradition, which can become its own weird, enclosed, sectarian milieu that speaks to itself and cannot deal with even its own internal inconsistencies. That by the sign of things is a bad sign, and that the whole Marxist revival hasn't done away with that. It's just changed its nominal form. It's kind of a big deal. The sectlets have not gone away. They're just tendencies now, and something even more subsumed by parts of the status quo, parts with more real, tangible power. And a lot of people's response to that is to rebel, but to rebel by going to just a different part of the status quo, as if no one could imagine a way to cut through liberalism without making concessions to elements of it. Some of that's popular front habits, but it's not just that. We have to deal with that. And nor do I see the whole multipolarity as settling the matter. Yes, sure, the liberal world can no longer assume dominant hegemony, but there's a lot of ways in which the world that we still live in is just different forms of the same problem. No one's transcended the market society, or is even trying to. Now, I will end this on a note that I've never thought that mere anti-liberalism was good enough, and I've known people who move from left to right off of mere anti-liberalism. And it doesn't get them anywhere. But we do have to see beyond this. We do have to see the intellectual and economic crises and the way they intersect. This is one good thing we should take away from Marxism. Not in a vulgar way of just cui bono, although cui bono is important, who benefits does matter, but in a bigger way in which we really do need to look at the material incentives and the way we reproduce our society, both in the terms of our legal structures and in the terms of our economics, that are limiting the way we can think. Because I find a lot of the responses of leftism to liberalism to be anemic and to reincorporate some of the worst elements of liberalism's degeneracy. For people to need the oligarchy to protect them, so they protect the oligarchy in ways that are delirious to their own political project. Delirious and deleterious. But delirious is actually true, because one has to believe in things that are utterly incomprehensible and incoherent to do so. Like and subscribe if you want more of this. I've noticed that my numbers are pretty good these days, but that none of them are stellar. I hope you're enjoying these solo shows. If you're not, you can stop. You're still going to get the interviews, and maybe tell me what you like about them. I'm never quite sure which of these hits and which one doesn't, except that when I go off on weird tangents about things like the historical school of German economics or something, people kind of tune out. But it's important because it's actually contextually necessary for other things that we talk about. We're always bracketing out traditions that overlap with things that we like, but don't really directly speak to it. Art speak to alternative traditions that are very similar, but don't fit our neat triumphalist narratives. We shouldn't do that. And on that, good night.